What is the most awkward thing that a professor has done during a lecture? Gets phone call in class, stops teaching to answer it. Alright, guys, I'm going to have to pick up my kids from soccer practice. Just wait here for about half an hour. Half an hour later. Okay, I'm back. Anyway, like I was saying. I had an psych professor who was a big energetic, sweaty dude. He would pace and sweat all through his lectures. He always had a bandana to mop his brow. People said he must be doing coke. The weird part was when we strolled into class one day and we had a new teacher. The sweaty professor was arrested on child molestation charges. It made his abnormal psychology lectures much more interesting, in hindsight. To be fair, this was a prof-student shared effort. In my Spanish class a few years ago, if anybody's cell phone went off during class, they had to bring in a cake the next class period for everyone as some sort of punishment. Well, one day our professor's phone went off and she actually answered it in the middle of the lecture and proceeded to have a full-on fight with, apparently, her boyfriend, in front of the entire class. After she hung up, there was about a 10-15 second silence where she started to cry. When she started to actually shed tears, one student said out loud, "So are you bringing in cake tomorrow?" What a nice kid. Trying to make her laugh. My history professor has a hook for a hand. One day he took it off and the sock he had over his arm nub, drew a face on it, and started talking to the class with it like a puppet. I had an econ teacher who was getting Peter bee buzzing around the room. In the middle of his lecture, he caught the bee barehanded, threw it on the ground, and stepped on it in one fluid motion. Afterwards, looked at us and said, "That is a warning for the other bees," then continued on with the lecture. After typing it out, "This sounds more awesome than awkward. Oh well." On the awesome professor note, mine just today threw a box cutter blade at the wall like a ninja star, stuck it on the first try, and says that's a kill shot. My Dutch econ professor asked some sort of math question. The one Asian student raised his hand and answered. This prompted my professor to go on a rant about how the American school system was terrible, and that only international students answered math questions. It was at this point that the Asian kid said, "I'm from Cleveland. Please tell me the kid's name was Mark." My high school physics teacher used to have bowling balls in his room for an experiment he did every year. At the end of the year he told everyone to grab a bowling ball and chuck it at something. Being the good students we were, we destroyed the classroom. Turns out before our class started the administrator called him telling him that he was losing his job. He was the best physics teacher I have ever had. That physics professor was a freaking baller. In my poetry class, we were discussing a group's presentation that had something to do with human sounds made in emotion that have no ties to written language and so were universal. At the end of their audio clip that was filled with just weird guttural sounds, they used the audio from the climax scene in When Harry Met Sally, but at the end she says the words "oh god" or something like that. We went into a discussion about the use of culturally learned words to express passion and how they are different in other places. The awkward thing my professor did was ask the German exchange student, who had a huge crush on him, if she said "oh god" or something similar during sex but in German. She went beet red and asked in a thick accent, "Are you asking me what I sound like during climax?" Whole class bursts out laughing. Professor buries his face in his hands and profusely apologizes but still kinda laughs about it. TLDR. Professor asks student what she sounds like when she climaxes. I had a history professor who used to come into the class in a full three-piece suit. During the first 5 minutes of class he would proceed, while lecturing, to remove his tie, suit jacket, vest, dress shirt, and belt. He would then finish the lecture in an undershirt and dress pants. Why he did this I will never know, but it was every day without fail. Super awkward to be lecturing about the Holocaust while undoing the buttons of your shirt, dude. My psych professor once described a rather elaborate wet dream he had as a young man about a woman in white lingerie while we were talking about Freud. He just stared off into space for a bit after he was done. Room full of female students. Had a prof get served divorce papers in class. He said "excuse me one moment" and walked behind a small partition. A small boat of sailors could not curse the way he cursed out his soon-to-be ex-wife. After about 2 minutes, he walked out from behind the partition and went right back to the lecture. My technical writing professor critiqued his divorce papers on the overhead. It was pretty bad. Nobody is paying attention in physics. The professor walks up to an Asian boy who is playing games on his iPhone, takes the calculator TI-83 off of the kid's desk, and slams it on the ground with enough force that the calculator shatters. He then proceeds to teach as if nothing happened. He asked the Asian kid to stay behind after lecture and ended up giving the Asian kid one of his TI-84s. Frick yeah, upgrade. Nobody is even listening to me. Maybe tonight I should just go home and kill myself. Class goes silent. Ignore me saying that. I had a prof show up to class with a stray kitten that he found, tucked inside his winter coat. He then proceeded to solicit food from the class to feed it and then abandoned the class for 15 minutes to go play with it in his office. I would have told the class that I found a kitten and that class was dismissed. My sociology professor answered a Skype call from her Jew sister, legit what she called her, in the middle of class. Kept her on the screen and she just watched our class until she started screaming okay I'm going to go now and hung up. This is the funniest one. Holy crap, can't stop laughing. Just seems so uncomfortable. In my archaeology class last year, we had a legendary professor barge into the class during lecture. He's this 80-something-year-old guy and just skips around the classroom. We're too baffled to know what to say or do. Finally, my professor decides to ask him what the heck he's doing. I went to the doctor yesterday and asked about my new medication. I'm supposed to skip a day between taking pills, so I'm skipping today. He managed to skip around a few more times before leaving without saying a word. You call him Dr. Jones. Setting, Intro to Archaeology, and we are covering obsidian tools. Prof hands out several small obsidian blades to pass around the class, stressing how they are sharp so be careful. Then he tells us he performed an experiment when he had his vasectomy. He asked the surgeon to use a scalpel on one side and an obsidian blade on the other so he could see which side healed faster. Telling your class you are now firing blanks is a little awkward, but he then let slip that one of the blades going around the class was the blade used during the surgery. Holding a tool that cut your prof's vas deferens is quite awkward. Even though everyone absolutely loved this professor, we were initially caught off guard by his early shenanigans. One day, he was bragging about his sex life, going into great detail about how it's an awesome idea to go to bars sober and offer to drive drunk women home. Eventually, he proudly proclaims, "Believe me, if this finger could talk, it'd have a lot to say." He then held his middle finger under a petrified looking Asian kid's nose in the front row, and surprisingly, you could hear it pin drop for quite some time after the fact. Otenya. German prof told us that sometimes, in order to get good pronunciation, you just had to give it your best Nazi. Then he said "Mach schnell," do it quickly, or make haste, and made whipping noises. My German prof told us that the reason Germans drink so much beer is so they can pronounce the words easier. Haha. We had an international day and she was explaining words she couldn't get the hang of saying when she was learning English. One of them was Pythagorean, and she said, no matter how hard I tried, it just wouldn't come in my mouth. She quickly changed the subject. I was taking a class and the teacher for some reason wanted to show us all Second Life. As he was showing it to us, he was flipping through his character skins and one of them was Large Dong Angel Boy. This was kind of awkward, mainly because my prof was really awkward, but it was also really awesome. So it was astronomy class last spring, and it was a class of about 250-300. The professor was a total pushover and basically seemed to have resigned to the fact that no one really paid any attention in his class. The majority of people would basically be on their laptops for the entire class. I could tell this made him sad. He was pretty reminiscent of Eeyore in his demeanor, but there wasn't really anything he could do about it. This all makes the following story even more awesome. We were learning about wormholes and about how something could theoretically go into a wormhole and emerge on the other side, at a different point in space. The class was held in a large lecture hall, and there were doors at the front of the classroom, on either side. So in the middle of the lecture, he walks out of the classroom on the left side, still talking, which the class could hear since he was wearing a wireless microphone. and immediately another professor bearing a striking resemblance to our professor comes in through the doors on the right, wearing the exact same outfit as our professor and attempting to, at least, lip-syncing our professor as he continued on the lecture. Our professor came back into the room as his doppelganger exited. They did it a couple more times for effect and people loved it. I think it might have been the only time all semester he had the class's full attention. It was brilliant. TLDR. Astronomy professor demonstrated wormholes by exiting the room in mid-lecture and having a doppelganger enter through the other side of the room. Now you're thinking with portals. Said orgasm incredibly loudly, and then went on with his lecture. Backstory was, in a previous paper for the class, I had gone into detail on some point or another, and had ended with something like, I would have brought this up during the discussion, but I didn't want to be the first person to say orgasm in class. Only problem was, I missed the class he said it in. So instead of me laughing hysterically and explaining the whole mess, everyone just stared in confused silence and I got to hear about it from a friend later. Poor professor. You ruined his joke. When students get bored in my classes, sometimes, I stop, I look at the ceiling and whistle, impersonating birds who have a conversation. I know birds, and I can reproduce pretty accurately the singing of some. First, students are surprised, then very entertained and, finally, anxious I might continue for more than 1 minute. It makes me happy. Birds are happy creatures. I like birds. I had a lecturer who refused to continue with the lecture until one of the students in the audience uncrossed her arms. He was incredibly stubborn, but so was she. After about, I kid you not, 20 minutes of awkwardness, she walked out of the lecture and he continued with the class. The kicker? It was a legal ethics class. Her breasts must have been amazing. I had a professor who would walk around the room during his lectures. Whenever he stopped, he would promptly prop his package right on the corner of the nearest table. Or, I feel so bad for your teacher. I have this professor who's just very eccentric. Many awkward moments happen during his class. For example, he will curse and say generally politically incorrect things in class if we promise we won't report him to the head of his department. One particularly amusing incident happened last year in Android Dev when he told us about the book he was planning to write, How to Get Black Women Interested in Computer Science. He kept going on about how he's going to get fired for saying that, even 5 minutes after the fact. His slogan for my freshman level CS class was freaking experiment. He looked straight at me and said, my name, write that down. So I did. My mom found that notebook over one of my breaks and wondered what in the world we were doing in class. Another time he mistakenly thought I was texting under the table during one of his lectures. He stopped mid-sentence and said, my name, put that dang machine away. I held my hands up in the air, revealing no cell phone. He just said oh and continued with the lecture as if nothing had happened. He recently got married to a much younger woman. A classmate in web systems was developing an inverse of ratemeprofessors.com called Rate My Student for his project, and this professor suggested adding a hotness rating for the students, or would that be too inappropriate? We, the class, said it would be creepy. Then he asked would it be creepy for a 50-year-old to rate the hotness of a 30-year-old. We told him it would be a lot less creepy. He said, good, because I married one, and laughed really awkwardly for like a minute. I just really hope he doesn't read Reddit because he will know who I am and that I am talking about him. D. I'm sorry, you're still a good teacher. In my experience, CS professors are some of the strangest professors there are. It really takes a special kind of person to get a PhD in computer science. It wasn't a lecture, it was a smaller class, workshop style, so we all sat around desks arranged into a square shape. Teacher was trying to hand a paper back to me, changed her mind and gave up halfway through standing up, created the most pathetic, not aerodynamic paper airplane anyone's ever made ever, threw it, watched it drift onto the ground and cackled like a maniac, then crawled into the center of the desks to get the paper and then tried to throw it up to me several times while still laughing maniacally as it kept falling back at her. I wish I could describe the airplane better. She literally folded the paper in half and then dog-eared one corner and sort of crumpled the front. Another time I went to the first meeting of a Saturday screenwriting class taught by a famous screenwriter. I'm new to Reddit and we can't name names, right? who'd insisted on breaking all school policies about when classes could be held and made everyone meet on Saturday. He showed up with a random pretty female assistant who'd apparently driven him the 2 hours from LA. This was in San Diego, and he was completely trashed. He ranted for 2 hours about nothing, really, made various inappropriate remarks, went half an hour over the end time so he could talk about his personal life, had his assistant pass around his Oscar at the end so everyone could touch it, then promptly quit and left the school students screwed since they couldn't get anyone to teach a Saturday class. Also, a really high percentage of my professors were former sex industry workers and talked about their experiences all the time, which was awkward at first and then just felt normal after a while. Creative writing major. It's good times. I had a professor who used to work at Playboy. Most useful thing I learned in that class: if you want to stay under an NC-17 rating, the penis has to be under 45 degrees. We had protractors and everything. My other favorite was if you're filming a threesome, the girls have to have 2 different hair colors, otherwise people lose track. I guess this isn't that awkward in terms of actions, but my group theory professor, who was wearing a mathlete t-shirt that had a calculator that said 8,008,135 on it, was presenting a theorem. So who wants to see the proof done this way? Or who would prefer the proof this way? Any preferences? Some people. I see. Some preferences. Well, I don't care. We're going to do it this way, because daddy gets what daddy wants. I once had a soft-spoken, older instructor who wore a wireless mic so he could wander around and still be heard. He forgot to take it off when he went to the restroom during a break. The whole class heard him urinate in surround sound. A professor who is retiring and had his last class a few weeks ago rode his bicycle to class, taking a detour through each classroom on the way to his classroom. He rode his bike to all his classes that day, through the halls, wherever he went. He is a Redditor. Hi Peter, you nut. My professor was reading off his slides in class and messing up all the words, and he stopped after 10 minutes, sighed and said, "Sorry guys, I'm a bit hungover." A student said, "Sir, it's Wednesday." The prof replied, "I'm aware." This happened 7th grade biology class. Teacher, alright class, today we start learning about reproduction. On that note, testicles. Testicles, testicles, testicles. Other teacher walks in. "Hey Ms. Don't have you?" Teacher, testicles. OT. Never mind then. I don't know if it was exactly awkward, but my Shakespeare professor claims to have a photographic memory. Crazy awesome older prof, and she really does have a pretty good memory. Before the first day of class, this is a 200-person lecture BTW, she memorized every student based on pictures, and then called out every student by name who showed up to the first day late. Freaked a few people out. Oh my gosh, this occurred when I was still in high school. We had a very unique math teacher, Ms. G. She could teach well, and was incredibly smart, but very, very strange. During the Cold War, she worked for the US Navy, and throughout the year would tell us stories of how she used math on a daily basis in the Navy. She had done work on the Star Wars project, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, in the 80s, which was essentially a way to shoot down incoming ICBMs, nukes, with lasers in space and on the ground. 20 years later she was at a private school teaching math. A few screws may have come loose up top, but she was still a good teacher. We had another teacher who was quite the prankster. We shall call him Mr. U. One day, Mr. U thought it would be a good idea to call Ms. G and shout into the phone, "Ms. G, this is the Pentagon. We need you." Ms. G slammed down the phone and booked it out of the classroom. She apparently ran by the front desk and shouted, "I'm taking a leave of absence. My country needs me." She didn't have a car, so she ran about 3 blocks until the vice principal chased her down and demanded an explanation. Mr. U then had to apologize to the school. TLDR. Teacher pranks another teacher. Vice principal chases her down as she ran out of the school because she thought the Navy needed her. I can only imagine her tying on a cape before she ran from the building. We were learning about molecular signaling in biology, and the professor was explaining how the cell could sequester the receptor molecules and bring them into the cell, destroying them if need be. As an analogy, he compared it putting a child in a corner, chopping him up, And, if you did it right, you could put him back together. There was a lot of nervous laughter, and the professor realized that it wasn't a very appropriate example. My human sexuality professor took us on a field trip to the 3 local sex shops in town. One had viewing booths and she took us back, in a single file line through the maze of dark booths, ignoring the sound of heavy breathing and coins dropping into the machines. At one of the stores I was admiring the array of stripper heels. She pointed to a giant feathery black pair and said she was coming back for them. She wasn't kidding. Oh, and she got us all 20% off their merchandise. Best professor ever. I'm becoming that professor. I'm so excited. Kids need to know why balls. They want to know why. Nobody needs to know. Just shut your trap, follow along. My professor went on a rant about how a kid in a different class always asked why something was done a certain way. It reminded him of an article he read about how kids need to know why. I could not stop laughing. I was once in a CS class consisting of 4 people. One day everyone skipped lecture but me. The professor lectured anyway. He kept asking things like, does anyone know how? Blah blah blah. That would be ridiculously awkward. Economics professor, who was about as flamingly gay as one could be, was talking about preference curves. Out of the blue, he comments, I bet you can all guess my preference bricks were shat. Read with the narrator's voice of the famous Honeybaja Don't Give a Crap video. Would read again. Updoot included. I had a calculus professor who one day stopped in the middle of working a problem on the chalkboard, erased everything, slammed his hands onto his podium, yelled frick, Osmama, Bin Laden, and ran out of the room. That's a heck of a homework assignment. My friend was studying medicine and his Dutch medical professor started his first lecture in his first year by saying that he did not want students to find out too late if they were afraid of blood or dead people, causing students to drop out after several months. He then announced that he would perform a simple autopsy in this very same class, went away to go to a refrigerated room and returned with a body on a stretcher covered by a blanket, only showing its feet. Especially some female students were scared as the autopsy was unannounced. It was 9 in the morning and many students had not had breakfast yet. The professor proceeded by slowly removing the blanket, starting at its feet, saying, first we need to see if we're dealing with a man or a woman. Suddenly he removed the blanket. A guy jumped up from the stretcher in his boxers, running through class and leaving the classroom through the rear exit. The professor was laughing and the whole class was left mortified. Apparently he performs this joke every year for freshmen and most students think it's hilarious. I had a chem professor who was lecturing on oxidation. It was his last year teaching before retiring. He also led singing at a local church. Most genuine man I've ever met. He said that's why you keep your tools in the tool shed, to keep them from rusting. Sometime I'll have to tell you the story of my hoe, he says to 200 Chem 4 engineering students. We all snicker, and he says, oh, you want to hear it now? Okay, then we all brace ourselves. Well, one day I was out in my cornfield, just me and my hoe. All of a sudden this coon comes out of nowhere, middle of the day and everything. Well, the coon stops right in front of me and looks me straight in the eyes. I whacked that coon with my hoe. So I'm sitting there all proud of myself when my wife comes out to tell me there's a phone call. She sees me with my hoe and that dead coon and about as a heart attack. I was literally out of my desk rolling on the ground laughing my absolute hardest. He felt real good about himself too. A real stand-up comedian I imagine, because he had 200 students in complete stitches. My friends and I, through tears, were asking each other if he had any idea what he was saying. Fast forward 3 hours, I have lab. He comes into the lab, straight-faced, sets his briefcase down, and announces to the class that he had learned something today. 2 people can apparently have different meanings for the same word. I had gone back to my office and gathered up the chemistry faculty and told them of how I had my Chem 134 lecture roaring. I told them the story and they told me why you were all laughing. I again hit the floor, in laughter. TL. DR. Chem prof didn't know that hoe and coon had multiple meanings. In my Civil War history class, the professor died. A girl wandered up to ask him a question and he was just frozen looking down at the papers on his desk. The girl was extremely calm about it and just told the GA, and he made the somber in-class announcement right after making a call to 911. He walked around the back of the room to make the call. I had a calculus professor use this analogy to explain why 0/2 equals 0 and 2/0 is undefined. You can go topless, but not bottomless. Someone wrote C on the attendance sheet and our hardcore feminist professor went off on how she took it as a compliment to her femininity and all this. Her whole tirade concluded with her screaming and grabbing her crotch. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.